In April 2025, Amazon stunned the world by announcing plans to move its headquarters out of the United States, a decision that no one saw coming, not even the most seasoned industry insiders. The news broke early one morning, sending shockwaves through the business world and igniting a media firestorm that would dominate headlines for weeks. The impact was immediate and far-reaching, with reactions rippling from Amazon's longtime home in Seattle all the way to the corridors of power in Washington, D.C. Investors, employees, and politicians alike scrambled to make sense of the bombshell announcement, as speculation swirled about Amazon's next destination and the reasons behind such a dramatic move. President Trump, just months into his second term, saw this as a personal and national betrayal. He wasted no time in taking to social media and the airwaves, blasting Amazon and Jeff Bezos for what he called a blatant abandonment of American workers and values. The president's outrage was palpable, and he made it clear that he viewed the move as a direct challenge to his administration's economic agenda. He vowed swift, severe consequences, framing Amazon's exit as not just a business decision, but an unpatriotic act that threatened the nation's economic security. Trump promised to punish any company considering a similar move, warning that the days of American corporations turning their backs on the country were over. The confrontation escalated quickly, with Trump personally berating Bezos in a leaked phone call that made headlines around the globe. In the call, the president threatened sweeping action, making it clear that no company, no matter how powerful, was above the interests of the American people. This clash birthed the administration's so-called Reciprocal Tariff doctrine, a bold new policy designed to reshape the rules of global commerce and protect American interests at all costs. Under this doctrine, if American companies left the country, both foreign nations and those companies would pay a steep price, through tariffs, restrictions, and a host of new regulations. The message was clear. Loyalty to the United States would be rewarded, but disloyalty would come at a heavy cost. The White House declared it a matter of fairness and national pride, using Amazon's move as the perfect narrative to justify a sweeping wave of protectionist measures. The administration argued that these steps were necessary to defend American jobs and industries from what they called corporate desertion. The stage was set for a summer of economic chaos, as the U.S. prepared to upend global trade. Markets reeled, businesses braced for impact, and world leaders watched anxiously, knowing that the fallout from Amazon's decision would be felt far beyond America's borders. The Amazon drama became the rallying cry for a new era of American economic aggression, one that would reshape the global landscape and test the resolve of corporations, governments, and citizens alike. The president's fury was unmistakable, his frustration boiling over in public speeches and behind closed doors. That anger quickly morphed into a sweeping global trade offensive, sending shockwaves through international markets and diplomatic circles alike. In July, the administration dispatched tariff letters to over 20 nations, announcing sweeping duties on a vast array of goods. Everything from steel and cars to copper and pharmaceuticals was suddenly in the crosshairs. Allies and rivals alike were hit hard. 50% tariffs on EU steel, 25% on imported cars, a staggering 200% on pharmaceuticals and more. Even the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, faced a 10% tariff, justified by the administration as punishment for so-called anti-American policies. For everyday Americans, the consequences were immediate and personal. Prices on electronics, cars, and basic household goods began to climb as global supply chains unraveled, leaving families and businesses scrambling to adjust. The administration justified the shock as reciprocity, but it was reciprocity strictly on U.S. terms, often ignoring long-standing trade agreements and risking a dangerous spiral of global retaliation that threatened to upend the world order. Economists and financial experts sounded the alarm, warning of a looming recession and market instability, but the White House pressed on, determined to rebalance the scales in America's favor, no matter the cost. Around the globe, governments and businesses braced for impact as the tariff tsunami hit, threatening to dismantle decades of economic interdependence and cooperation. The cost of doing business with America was about to skyrocket, leaving the world uncertain about what would come next. The first casualty of the trade war was the American consumer. Tariff announcements landed just before Amazon's Prime Day, turning a shopping holiday into a symbol of economic anxiety. Sellers faced impossible choices: absorb higher costs, or pass them to customers, with many opting out of Prime Day deals altogether. Surveys showed nearly a quarter of Americans planned to skip Prime Day, and most were wary of inflated prices. The tariffs reshaped consumer behavior, shifting spending from enthusiasm to caution. The impact rippled beyond retail. Used car prices surged as buyers anticipated costlier imports, and inflation crept into groceries and appliances. The promise of America First was starting to feel like first to pay more. Tariffs were no longer abstract, they were hitting wallets everywhere. The tariff shockwaves rattled American business from small shops to Wall Street. Uncertainty paralyzed strategy. Decades-old supply chains were suddenly obsolete, and costs became unpredictable. The stock market plunged, erasing billions in value as investors lost confidence in the administration's confrontational approach. Imports from China collapsed, forcing companies into costly, chaotic searches for new suppliers. Tariffs on raw materials like copper drove up prices, squeezing manufacturers and fueling inflation. The result: higher costs for businesses, higher prices for consumers, and a vicious cycle of anxiety and reduced demand. Friendshoring and reshoring proved slow and expensive, leaving companies scrambling. The tariff turmoil threatened to choke growth and innovation across the economy. The world reacted to America's tariff blitz with disbelief, anger, and urgent calculation. Allies like the EU, hit with crippling tariffs, condemned the measures and threatened retaliation, while scrambling for diplomatic solutions. The EU proposed a universal 10% tariff to avoid all-out war, signaling a reluctant acceptance of US leverage. China warned against exclusion from new supply chains and positioned itself as a defender of free trade, strengthening ties elsewhere. Other nations, facing steep tariffs, rushed to negotiate exemptions or truce deals, as multilateralism gave way to transactional bilateral talks. Even brief truces, like Boeing's jet deliveries to China, were temporary, highlighting the new deal-by-deal reality. The global order fractured, with Washington dictating terms and partners forced to adapt or risk economic pain. The era of predictable rules-based trade was over. International diplomacy became a series of high-stakes, bilateral showdowns. The US used overwhelming threats to force countries to the table, measuring success by concessions won, not mutual benefit. Vietnam, threatened with a 46% tariff, negotiated it down to 20%. A victory for the White House, but a painful compromise for Hanoi. The EU, desperate to protect its industries, countered with a 10% across-the-board tariff, seeking carve-outs for sensitive sectors. Temporary deals like Boeing's truce with China served narrow interests and added to the sense of unpredictability. Corporate lobbying and direct White House appeals became key to tariff outcomes, fueling perceptions of unfairness. The global economy was now governed by ad hoc deals, not stable rules. Every nation and company was left to fend for itself in a world of transactional chaos. Nowhere was the unpredictability clearer than with Canada. After Mark Carney became Prime Minister, Trump floated the idea of Canada becoming the 51st U.S. state, an audacious, bewildering proposal. This, along with talk of annexing Greenland, signaled a disregard for established norms and sovereignty. Canada, deeply intertwined with the U.S. economy, faced the threat of tariffs and aggressive demands. Ottawa responded by scrapping its digital services tax, hoping to ease tensions and resume trade talks. The move paid off, negotiations restarted, but the underlying tension remained. The 51st state idea lingered as a symbol of the administration's unconventional worldview. Canada, like other allies, walked a tightrope, appease U.S. demands to avoid pain while defending its own sovereignty. Even America's closest partners were forced to adapt to a new transactional reality. The deepest impacts of the tariff war were often hidden. The pharmaceutical industry scrambled to relocate production as 200% drug tariffs loomed, risking shortages and inefficiencies. Companies hoarded cash and cut investments, fearing sudden policy shifts could wipe out profits overnight. The climate of uncertainty stifled growth, innovation, and job creation, ironically undermining the administration's stated goals. U.S. withdrawal from global bodies like the WHO and Paris Agreement signaled retreat, ceding influence to rivals like China. The world's economic architecture began to shift, with America's leadership role in question. The ripple effects were not just economic but geopolitical, redrawing alliances and power structures. the true cost of the trade war would take years, if not decades, to fully reveal. As summer 2025 draws to a close, the world finds itself at a pivotal crossroads, shaped and scarred by the ongoing fractures of Trump's trade war. The global economy, once tightly interwoven, now faces a moment of profound uncertainty, with nations and businesses forced to reconsider their place in a rapidly changing landscape. Three futures loom on the horizon, each with its own risks and opportunities. One possibility is a world of entrenched economic blocks where alliances harden and cooperation fades. Another is a return to a rules-based order where nations recommit to global institutions and shared frameworks, or perhaps most likely a messy, fragmented middle ground, where uncertainty becomes the new normal. In the first scenario, the world splits into US and China-led spheres with supply chains rewired along political lines. This would mean higher costs, inefficiencies, and a constant risk of conflict as countries compete for influence and resources. Businesses would be forced to choose sides, and consumers would feel the impact in their daily lives. Another path could see a backlash against protectionism, as public pressure and economic pain force leaders to seek renewed cooperation. In this scenario, countries might gradually rebuild trust, re-establishing the frameworks that once underpinned global trade and prosperity. Yet, the most probable outcome is a hybrid, a world marked by permanent tariffs, piecemeal trade deals, and a sense of constant uncertainty. Negotiations will be ongoing, and stability will be elusive. Companies will be forced to adapt, building more resilient but expensive supply chains. The global economy will limp along, less efficient and more volatile, as businesses and workers adjust to a new reality of risk and unpredictability. The Amazon HQ drama and the ongoing tariff turmoil have forced a reckoning with the fragility of global interdependence. The world can no longer take seamless trade and cooperation for granted. The challenge now is clear: to decide what, if anything, should replace the old order. Leaders, businesses, and citizens alike must grapple with the question of how to build a more stable and equitable system for the future. The choices made in the coming months and years will define the economic landscape for a generation, shaping not just markets but the very fabric of our interconnected world.